My name's Mark, and up until a few years ago, I thought I had everything I needed in my marriage to Grace. She and I met right here in Boston, sharing a mutual love for the city, our favorite coffee shop on Beacon Hill, and countless evenings overlooking the Charles River. We were ordinary, I suppose, but in a way that made me feel lucky every day I was with her. For the first few years, life was pretty simple. We built up our lives from scratch in a tiny one-bedroom apartment just off Harvard Avenue. She worked as a teacher at a local elementary school, and I took a position in finance. We had our routines, our shared ambitions, and plans to save for our future. When we weren't working, we spent most of our time exploring the city, trying new restaurants, or taking little trips up to New Hampshire whenever we could. Then, Grace met Lena and Brianna. It's not that I didn't want her to have friends. After all, everyone needs someone they can confide in, a little time apart from their spouse to unwind. But something about these two always made me uneasy. From what I gathered, they were her colleagues, teachers with a good bit more money, more time, and apparently a lot of advice about marriage. And as much as I tried to brush it off, something told me they were trouble. They were nice enough when we met. Lena was tall, sleek, with the kind of self-assurance that's almost too much for any room. Brianna had this air of constant amusement, always smirking about something, usually her latest escapade. When they were around, I could feel their eyes on me, as if they were evaluating, judging, looking for something I wasn't giving Grace. They didn't say much to me, of course. I was just the husband. Grace and I started seeing less of each other. It was gradual at first. Dinners out with them a couple times a week, a few girls, only weekends, a slow fade that I couldn't put my finger on until I realized how empty our calendar had become. Our simple nights in, watching movies or cooking together, became rare. One evening, I got back from work to find Grace laughing on the phone with Lena. As I dropped my bag, I caught a snippet of their conversation. Lena was telling some story about her weekend away, some romantic escapade in a fancy hotel downtown with someone new. I'd never heard Grace laugh quite like that. It had an edge, something almost eager, like she was hearing secrets meant just for her. That night, I tried bringing it up. "So, Lena has a new guy?" I asked, keeping it casual. Grace didn't even look up from her phone. "Oh, she's just trying something different," she said with a shrug. "Lena thinks it's good to keep things interesting." "Right. I guess you know them better than I do." I left it at that, hoping it would blow over, that these stories were just something her friends liked to brag about. But Grace's attitude was different. Small, subtle changes that would have been hard to notice if I weren't living them every day. It was little things at first. The way she'd get dressed in the morning, a new edge to her makeup, the way she held herself as if trying to exude confidence. When I'd compliment her, she'd brush it off, saying, "Lena thinks it's time for a bit of a style change." Then there were the Friday nights she'd come home later than expected, claiming dinner with Brianna ran long, or they'd lost track of time, over a bottle of wine. Her excuses started to feel rehearsed, like she had rehearsed them for my benefit. The weekend trips increased, too. "It's just a girls' weekend at the Cape, Mark," she'd say. "It'll be fun, and besides, we see each other every day." The way she said it stung, and I couldn't help but wonder if this distance was something she was seeking on purpose. I tried to join her a couple of times, but she'd smile, pat my hand, and tell me, "You wouldn't enjoy it. It's just girl talk." Around the fifth weekend in as many months, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't tell you exactly what it was, but something didn't sit right. I asked her about it again, hinting at my discomfort, but she brushed it off. "You're being paranoid, Mark. You know how Lena and Brianna are. They just like to talk about things they don't even do." But I wasn't so sure. By the time autumn rolled around, our life had become something I barely recognized. Grace's social calendar was so packed, I started to wonder if I was even a part of it anymore. Dinners were rare, and on the evenings we did share, her attention would shift constantly between her phone and fleeting, polite conversation with me. It felt like she was there in body, but miles away in her mind. And no matter how many times I tried to convince myself this was normal, a part of me couldn't shake the growing doubt. One evening, I tried to reach out to her in a way I hadn't in a while. I wanted us to feel close again, and I thought maybe if I planned a little weekend away, It would rekindle some of what had drifted away between us. I rented a quiet cabin in New Hampshire, told her I had the whole weekend arranged, and watched for her reaction. Instead of excitement, she gave me a reluctant smile. "I can't this weekend, Mark. I already promised Lena I'd go with her to this spa event. You understand, right? We can reschedule." Her voice was pleasant, but there was no warmth behind it, no real disappointment that she'd miss out on time with me. "Grace," I tried, keeping my tone as light as possible. "We haven't spent a weekend together in months. Maybe you could cancel with Lena just this once?" That night, as she slept beside me, my mind raced with questions. Was she meeting someone else? Was there more to these weekend trips and secretive calls than she'd been letting on? I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had happened to the woman I'd married. The woman who used to love nothing more than a quiet night in our apartment, talking about our future and dreaming about the places we'd travel together. By morning, I'd convinced myself I was overreacting, that maybe it was just her friends putting ideas in her head and encouraging her to act out in ways that felt foreign to me. But a part of me couldn't forget the look on her face or the excitement in her voice. It was as if she'd been chasing a thrill, a rush, one that had nothing to do with us or the life we'd built. From that day on, my mind became a battleground. I tried not to jump to conclusions, to keep my suspicions from growing into something that could destroy us. But every time I looked at her, I wondered what was going on behind her gaze, what thoughts she wasn't sharing with me, what parts of herself she was now hiding. The doubt was there, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for any small sign to confirm it. And, sure enough, those signs would come. A few weeks after the dinner party, I began noticing more and more things that didn't add up. I felt almost like a stranger in my own home, piecing together clues like a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. Grace's late nights were now the norm, her absences explained by vague mentions of Lena or Brianna, and sometimes even work obligations. I'd catch her texting late into the night, sometimes hiding her phone screen if I happened to glance her way. Each time, I'd bite my tongue, telling myself I had to trust her. But that trust was slipping through my fingers faster than I could hold on. Then one Saturday afternoon, I got a call from a friend of mine, James. We hadn't seen each other in months, and he suggested grabbing a coffee at a small cafe down in Beacon Hill. I thought a little time away from the house might help clear my head, so I agreed. As we chatted about work and life, I started mentioning the strain Grace's friends seemed to be putting on our relationship, trying to get his perspective without getting into too many details. "Mark, don't take this the wrong way," he said, "but I actually saw Grace a few days ago with some guy. I thought maybe it was someone you knew, but you weren't with them. They looked close." My stomach sank. "What do you mean, close?" James hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "I saw them at that wine bar on Charles Street, the one we used to go to. They were sitting in the corner, talking quietly. She was leaning in pretty close. I didn't think anything of it, just figured it was a friend or coworker. But the way they looked at each other, it just felt different. I felt my pulse quicken, my mind racing through the possibilities. "Did you see him well enough to describe him?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. James shrugged. "Average height, dark hair, well-dressed. Definitely wasn't Lena or Brianna, though, unless they've changed a lot since I last saw them." I left the cafe that day with a feeling of dread that stayed with me the whole way home. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was probably just a colleague or a harmless friend. But as soon as I walked through the door and saw her texting again, that same guarded expression on her face, something snapped. "Who are you texting, Grace?" I asked, more sharply than I'd intended. She looked up, startled, but then quickly collected herself. "Just Brianna. We're planning another weekend trip, remember? You two have been spending a lot of weekends away lately," I said, struggling to keep my tone casual. "You sure this isn't something more?" Her eyes narrowed, the familiar annoyance flashing across her face. "Mark, you're being paranoid again. Can I not have friends without you questioning me every time I pick up my phone?" "Friends? James saw you with some guy a few days ago, at that wine bar on Charles. You didn't mention that." For the first time, her confidence seemed to falter. She looked away, biting her lip as if searching for the right words. He's just a friend, Mark. Someone from work. Since when do you have friends from work that I don't know about? I asked, struggling to hold back the frustration and hurt welling up inside me. She sighed, crossing her arms. This is exactly why I didn't tell you. Because you make a big deal out of nothing. Not every man I talk to is some threat to our marriage, Mark. Maybe not, I replied. But when you start hiding things from me, it feels like you're making me the outsider in my own marriage. The conversation ended there, with her storming out of the room and slamming the door behind her. I was left alone with a bitter taste in my mouth and a realization that things were worse than I'd thought. She wasn't going to admit anything, and I knew I couldn't confront her without something more concrete. It was no longer just suspicion. I needed proof. The next day, when Grace left for a shopping trip with Brianna, I decided to do something I never thought I would. I checked her phone records. I know it wasn't my proudest moment, and I felt like a fool even considering it. But I couldn't shake the thought that something was going on, and I needed answers. Scrolling through the list, I saw the usual calls and messages to Lena and Brianna. But there were others, too. Numbers I didn't recognize, some marked as private, with long calls late at night. One number, in particular, appeared over and over again, often at strange hours, sometimes right before she'd slip out the door for one of her weekend trips. That was all the confirmation I needed. The next weekend, when she claimed she was going away with Brianna, I followed her. I felt sick to my stomach the entire drive, torn between hoping I was wrong and bracing myself for the worst. She drove to a small bed and breakfast on the outskirts of the city, far enough from home that she probably thought no one would recognize her. Sure enough, as I watched from a distance, she met with a man who fit James's description perfectly. Dark hair, well-dressed, a look that was almost too polished for a simple friend. They hugged, lingered a little too long, then went inside together. I couldn't bring myself to watch any longer. I left before I saw anything else, my mind spinning with the realization that my wife, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, was betraying me in a way I never thought possible. That night, as I lay awake, her betrayal etched itself deeper into my mind, and a dark resolve began to form. She'd made her choice, and I wasn't going to let her take any more from me. I knew what I had to do, but I needed to plan it carefully, to bide my time and make sure she understood the full weight of her actions. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. A week passed since that devastating weekend, and I barely recognized myself anymore. Everything felt colder, sharper, and distant. I walked through each day on autopilot, pretending everything was fine, trying to keep up appearances, all while the truth churned inside me like a storm. I'd made my decision. I was going to confront her, but not in the usual way. I wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal, the full consequences of what she'd done to our marriage. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Grace had planned yet another girls' night, the third one that month, and the lie barely even registered with her as she casually told me over dinner. I watched her closely, wondering if she could feel the change in me, the bitterness behind every glance. But she was completely at ease, smiling over her glass of wine, laughing at some joke I didn't even hear. Once she left, I didn't hesitate. I knew she'd be meeting him, her friend from work, so I headed to the bar she frequented with him, a trendy spot just off Charles Street. I didn't care if I looked foolish or if anyone saw me. All I cared about was making sure she saw me, that she knew I was no longer the fool. When I arrived, I spotted them immediately. They were sitting in a cozy corner booth, their heads close together, Grace's hand resting on his arm. I felt my chest tighten, anger mixing with something even worse, a deep, aching sadness. I steadied myself, took a breath, and walked over. "Mind if I join you?" I said, my voice calm but laced with enough bitterness to make her jerk her head up, her face paling the instant she saw me. "Mark," she stammered, pulling her hand away from the man as if I hadn't already seen enough. What are you doing here?" I ignored her question and looked at her companion. "You must be the famous friend from work I've heard so much about. Nice to finally put a face to the name." The man looked as uncomfortable as Grace did. He stammered something, but I didn't bother to listen. Instead, I turned my attention back to Grace, who was now visibly shaken. "You know, Grace," I said, keeping my tone even, I think it's time we stop pretending. It's time we both admit what's been going on." Her eyes filled with panic. "Mark, please, not here." "Oh, don't worry," I replied, leaning in closer. "We'll save the real conversation for home. But I wanted you to know that I see you, Grace. I see exactly who you've chosen to become." With that, I turned and left, leaving her to scramble for words and explanations that, frankly, didn't matter anymore. I didn't need her excuses or her flimsy justifications. I'd seen the truth with my own eyes, and that was enough. Back at home, I waited, watching the minutes tick by, each one filled with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. Part of me still couldn't believe she'd done this, that the woman I'd built my life with was capable of something so calculated, so deeply hurtful. But there was another part of me, one that had grown louder and clearer in recent days, that was ready to see this through to the end. It was nearly midnight when Grace finally came home. She walked in quietly, her expression a mix of guilt and fear. She looked at me, standing in the middle of the living room, and her gaze softened as if she thought she could talk her way out of this. "Mark," she began, her voice trembling, "I know how this must look, but I can't explain. It's not what you think." I raised an eyebrow, letting out a humorless laugh. "Not what I think. Grace, I've been watching you for months. I've seen the lies, the secrets, the way you've shut me out. You were so focused on chasing after something new that you didn't even notice what you were destroying." She took a step closer, reaching out as if to comfort me, but I stepped back, keeping the distance between us. "Mark, please, it was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "A mistake?" I repeated, the word feeling hollow in my mouth. "You don't accidentally betray someone, Grace. This didn't just happen. You chose it, over and over again. You chose him. You chose your friends, and you left me out in the cold." She covered her face with her hands, and for a moment, she seemed genuinely remorseful. "I know," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I don't know what came over me. I felt so trapped, so restless. I listened to Lena and Brianna, and they made it sound so exciting, so freeing. I thought I could have that too." I shook my head, feeling a surge of anger. "So, you decided to throw away everything we built for a fantasy? For something as shallow as excitement?" She dropped to her knees then, looking up at me with tears streaming down her face. "Mark, please. I love you. I don't want to lose you. I'll do anything to fix this. Anything you ask. Just give me a chance." I watched her, feeling a mixture of pity and frustration. I'd imagined this moment countless times, thinking I'd feel satisfied seeing her beg, but the reality was empty. There was no satisfaction, no sense of justice, just a hollow ache where love had once been. After a long pause, I finally spoke. "You say you'll do anything? Then prove it. If you're serious about fixing this, I want you to cut ties with Lena and Brianna. I want no more late nights, no more secrets. If I see you slipping again, even once, we're done. Understood?" She nodded, her face desperate, hands clasped as if in prayer. "I swear, Mark, I'll cut them off. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." I let out a long, exhausted sigh. "Then we'll see. But don't think for a second that everything goes back to normal. It'll take time, and you'll have to earn back every ounce of trust you threw away. I'm not just forgiving you, Grace. This is your last chance. Don't make me regret it." As she stayed there, still on her knees, crying softly, I turned and walked away, leaving her with the weight of her choices and the consequences that came with them. There was no joy in this moment, no triumph, only the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd understand the gravity of what she'd done and find a way to make it right. In the days that followed our confrontation, the house felt quieter, almost like a weight had settled over it, one neither of us could shake. Grace kept her word, or at least made every show of trying to. Her late nights stopped, her phone stayed face up on the table, and she began to treat me with a kind of reverence I hadn't seen in years. It was strange, though. I wasn't sure if I was ready to accept her efforts at all. After everything that had happened, a part of me doubted whether trust could ever be fully restored. She cut off contact with Lena and Brianna immediately. I could tell it wasn't easy for her. They'd been her friends for years, I caught her staring at her phone once or twice, her thumb hovering over their names, a sad look in her eyes. But each time, she'd pull her hand back, as if remembering my words, and set the phone down again. Watching her struggle only added to the mix of emotions I was already dealing with. Anger, sadness, and maybe a glimmer of hope that she was finally putting us first. To her credit, Grace tried everything to reconnect with me. She planned small things for us to do together. Dinners at home, weekends hiking, or movie nights that had once been routine but had vanished somewhere along the way. And for a while, I let myself get pulled along. I'd smile, laugh in the right places, and hold her hand when she reached for it. But it all felt strangely hollow. I couldn't stop thinking about the nights she'd spent with someone else, about how easily she'd been swayed by her friends, as if our years together meant nothing. Then one evening, about a month after our confrontation, I felt I needed to get some fresh air, to escape the confinement of our routines and the memories lurking in every corner of the house. I decided to visit my brother, Tom, who lived a few towns over. He was one of the few people who knew the full story and had stood by me without judgment. When I arrived, he welcomed me in, offering a beer and a listening ear. We sat in his backyard, the quiet of the evening broken only by the distant hum of passing cars. Tom had always been the steady one, the one with practical advice and a way of seeing things that put everything into perspective. "How's it going with Grace?" he asked after a while, his tone cautious. I took a long drink, gathering my thoughts. "She's trying. She cut off Lena and Brianna like I asked, and she's making an effort. But it's hard to forget what she did, you know? I feel like I'm just waiting for her to slip up again." Tom nodded, looking thoughtful. "I get it, man. Trust takes years to build, but it can be gone in a heartbeat. Do you still love her?" The question hit harder than I expected. I'd been so focused on the betrayal, on the hurt, that I hadn't taken the time to think about my own feelings. Did I still love her? Or was I just holding on to the memory of who she used to be, the woman I thought I'd married? "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe, but it's like I'm loving a stranger. She's not the same person I thought she was. And maybe I'm not the same either." Tom put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Sometimes people change, Mark, and sometimes they find their way back. But you can't force it. If it's going to work, you both have to want it. Not just to save face or because of memories, but because there's something worth fighting for." Those words stayed with me long after I left his place. They made me realize that I couldn't keep punishing Grace forever, couldn't hold her past over her like a sword, even if I wasn't sure how to let it go. When I got home that night, Grace was waiting for me, her face etched with worry. "I was starting to get worried," she said, rushing to my side. I offered a faint smile. "Just needed to clear my head." We sat together on the couch in silence for a while, the unspoken tension thick between us. Finally, she broke it. "Mark, I know things aren't the same, and I know it'll take a lot for you to trust me again. But I want you to know, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." I looked at her, searching for any trace of the woman I'd once loved so deeply. In her eyes, I saw genuine remorse, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she understood the pain she'd caused. "Grace," I said, my voice soft, "if we're going to make this work, we can't keep dancing around the truth. We have to face what happened head-on." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know. I've been so afraid that if I talk about it, I'll lose you completely." "Maybe," I replied, "but if we don't talk about it, we'll lose each other anyway." That night, we had the hardest conversation of our lives. She told me everything. How Lena and Brianna had made her feel trapped in our marriage, as if she was missing out on some grand adventure by staying committed. She admitted to being drawn to the thrill of secrecy, to the excitement of something new, something that felt forbidden. It was a brutally honest confession, one that tore me apart even as it allowed me to finally understand her choices. In return, I told her how her actions had shattered my trust, how I'd felt abandoned and betrayed. I didn't hold back, and she didn't look away. She absorbed every word, her face crumpling with each admission of hurt, and by the time we finished, It felt like a weight had lifted. Not entirely, but enough that we could start to see each other without the cloud of resentment. The days that followed weren't perfect, but they were different. Grace began to treat me with a new sense of gratitude, and I found myself slowly letting down the walls I'd built around my heart. It was a slow process, a painful one, but for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Then, one day, she came to me with a smile I hadn't seen in ages. "There's a couples retreat next weekend. It's focused on trust building and rebuilding relationships. I'd like us to go if you're willing." It was the first time she'd suggested something solely for us, something that wasn't about appeasing her guilt or patching things up on the surface. It felt genuine, and in that moment, I realized I was willing to give it a try. "All right," I said, taking her hand in mine. "Let's go." As we prepared for the retreat, I knew it wouldn't be a magic fix, that it wouldn't erase the past. But it was a start, a small step toward rebuilding the life we'd nearly lost. I didn't know if we'd ever return to the way things were, but maybe, just maybe, we could build something new, something even stronger than before. The retreat center was a modest place, tucked into a quiet corner of the countryside. It wasn't luxurious, but that was part of its charm. We arrived early in the morning, greeted by the soft light of dawn breaking over the trees, and the air was filled with a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. For once, it was just the two of us, away from the reminders of our past, our routines, and the strain of trying to force things back to the way they were. We joined a small group of other couples, each of them carrying their own invisible weights. The retreat facilitator, a seasoned counselor named Dr. Lawrence, was soft-spoken but firm. She began the session by emphasizing the importance of honesty and vulnerability. "This is a place for truth," she said, her gaze steady as it moved over each of us. "Healing begins when we stop hiding from ourselves and from each other." The first exercise was deceptively simple but unexpectedly challenging. We were asked to sit across from each other, maintaining eye contact without speaking for a full 5 minutes. It sounded easy enough, but as soon as Grace and I sat down and looked into each other's eyes, the weight of everything we'd been through seemed to settle between us like a physical presence. At first, I couldn't stop thinking about all the hurt, the betrayal, the lies. Every look, every smile we'd shared before felt tainted by the knowledge of what she'd done. But as the minutes passed, something shifted. Beneath the guilt in her eyes, I saw something else, a deep regret and a love that, despite everything, still held on. For the first time in months, I felt the anger in me begin to soften, just a little. There was no denying the pain she'd caused, but as I looked at her, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with, and I couldn't shake the hope that maybe we could still find our way back to each other. Throughout the retreat, we went through a series of exercises meant to rebuild trust and understanding. Some were lighthearted, writing down our favorite memories of each other, sharing things we appreciated about one another. Others were painful, forcing us to confront the ugliest parts of our relationship. Dr. Lawrence guided us through it all with gentle but unrelenting patience, encouraging us to dig deeper, to face our fears and insecurities head-on. The hardest exercise came on the second day. Each of us had to write a letter to our partner, detailing the ways they'd hurt us and what we needed to move forward. It was brutal, laying everything out on paper, knowing Grace would read it, but it was also freeing. For the first time, I could express everything I'd been holding back, every doubt, every resentment, every fear that I'd been too afraid to voice. Grace's letter to me was equally honest. She admitted to feeling trapped, to letting herself be influenced by Lena and Brianna, but she didn't shy away from taking responsibility. She didn't try to justify what she'd done. Instead, she acknowledged the pain she'd caused and the trust she'd shattered. She ended the letter with a promise to be better, to be the woman I deserved, and a plea for one last chance to make things right. Reading her words, I felt a shift within me. I knew our journey was far from over, that there were still countless obstacles to overcome, but for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Grace was truly remorseful, and I realized that I wanted to try, really try, to rebuild what we'd lost. The retreat ended with a final exercise, letting go ceremony, where we wrote down the things we wanted to release, our fears, our pain, our resentment, and burned them together. It was a symbolic gesture, but as I watched the flames consume my list, I felt a strange sense of relief. I knew the scars would remain, but I was ready to move forward, to give Grace and our marriage one last chance. When we returned home, things weren't perfect, but they were different. Grace continued to keep her word, focusing on us, on rebuilding our connection. She filled our weekends with small surprises, trips to places we loved, quiet dinners under the stars, even a photo album of our old memories, each page a reminder of what we'd shared. But even as we found a new rhythm, I knew that one last hurdle remained: trust. It was fragile, constantly tested by the memories that lingered, the doubt that lurked in the corners of my mind. And I knew that if we were going to make it, I had to address it head-on. One evening, as we sat on the back porch, I turned to her, breaking the comfortable silence. "Grace, I need to know something," I said, my voice steady. "Are you truly ready to leave that part of your life behind? To let go of the influence your friends had, the things they convinced you were missing?" She took my hand, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, Mark, I've already made that decision. I don't need them, or the life they tried to sell me on. I only want you and us. I've never been so sure of anything." Her words, simple as they were, reached me in a way nothing else had. I felt something settle within me, a certainty that, despite everything, we might just make it through. For the first time in a long time, I felt a cautious hope, a tentative belief that maybe we could build something new from the ruins of our old life. In the weeks that followed, I found myself relaxing, the weight of resentment lifting bit by bit. Grace continued to prove herself in small but meaningful ways, each gesture a reminder that she was here to stay, that she was committed to rebuilding the trust she'd broken. And as the months passed, I began to realize that I, too, was letting go of the hurt, the anger, the need to keep her at arm's length. One evening, as we lay in bed, Grace turned to me, a soft smile on her lips. "Do you think we'll be okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at her, at the woman who'd hurt me so deeply but had also fought so hard to make things right. And for the first time, I felt confident in my answer. "Yes," I said, pulling her close. "I think we will." Our marriage wasn't the same as it had been before. It was marked by scars, by the painful memories of what we'd been through. But in those scars, I found a strange kind of strength, a resilience that had been forged in the fires of betrayal and redemption. And as we moved forward, hand in hand, I knew that, no matter what lay ahead, we'd face it together. We weren't perfect, and we never would be. But in the end, maybe that was okay. Because we'd chosen each other, flaws and all, and we built something new, something stronger. And as I looked at Grace, her head resting on my shoulder, I realized that, despite everything, I still loved her. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.